Chapter 22. Well, if any of you had any second thoughts about this, it's too late now. They turned the corner, marching two abreast, with Hitch at the head of their little column. They had returned to the abandoned pier and retrieved their gear. Donning helmets, strapping on shields, and hoisting spears on their shoulders, they set off to the front gate with the air of someone returning to their home after a long absence. Knives tucked into their boots and belts, swords slapping on their thighs, they had asked for directions of the guards at the gate, where their little mercenary band might sign up to join the fun. They had been given directions to the old racetrack, which Hitch had made a great show of going over with them twice before heading off through town. Hitch had reminded them that as worthless cutthroats, they should sneer at the men and leer at the women. Cielo had been quite confused by this and simply did her level best to appear as tough as possible as she marched along with the others. Her artifice bow strung across her back, a quiver of arrows at her waist. Her long hair was tied back into a ponytail, and she wore her usual light tunic and pants. The tall and imposing buildings used by the town guard loomed ahead. The light-coloured stone blocks used in its construction had darkened on the lower level with rising mould, the splattered mud of passing wagons, and the soot from household hearths. The two upper levels had mostly escaped the fate of the ground floor, but the salt air had rotted away at the mortar in the joints, and a local pigeon population had evidently been contracted to coat the exterior in a protective layer of their own droppings. A line had already started to form of various individuals and groups wanting to sell their swords in the service of the Dark Queen and lining their own empty pockets and pouches. Scanning the group as they approached, Hitch thought to himself that someone must have tilted Kryn at an angle and all the scum had managed to tumble down into this port city. They wore a wide variety of armour, from basic and utilitarian to elaborately decorated. Swords and knives of every length and curve hung from their belts. Spears rested on shoulders, threatening to poke out the eye of the man or beast behind them, while the leather sheaths of battle axes chafed against sweating skin. Outcast dwarves and elves, mixed with humans of every region that Hitch was familiar with. A minotaur was led by a chain linked to a heavy iron collar around its neck. They shuffled slowly forward in the queue, spitting into the dirt beside them as they tried to estimate how much longer they would have to wait. Would they get an advance on their wages before the sun rose over the buildings and started to bake them alive when they should be sitting in a nice cool tavern? Hitch could almost feel the collective groan of his companions. Come on then, let's join the queue before it gets any longer. Turf had been experiencing a much harder morning than his companions. While they had been gathering their equipment and steeling their nerves for what lay ahead, he had been kicked awake by the ever-present taskmaster Janix. New recruits, or pond scum, as they were affectionately referred to, had not yet earned such luxuries and tents and blankets and been forced to sleep under the stars. Thoughts of personal space and modesty quickly abandoned as the temperature dropped. Men who had only met mere hours earlier found themselves huddled together. Turf had drifted off to sleep, wrapped up in another man's arms like he was a cherished stuffed toy from the man's childhood. Focusing on the comforting warmth his body gave into the exhaustion of a day spent literally fighting for his life. Sorry to disturb you all, Janix had bellowed as he moved along the line of bodies, stopping to kick at stomachs and backs. But we're all very hungry and waiting on our cooks. Rising to their feet, they stretched their aching limbs and rubbed the sleep from their eyes as they stumbled along like a herd of animals being led to the markets. They were divided up into groups and were soon splitting wood, stoking fires, and chopping the ingredients under the gaze of the burly cooks who looked like they only took this job as something to fill time when there was no one to torture in a dungeon. The aroma of the hot food soon had their stomachs growling. Their hopes of sating this hunger, though, were cruelly dashed when they were informed they would be bringing the food to the officers' mess tent to serve them. The scum gets what sinks to the bottom of the pond, Janix had announced with a cruel grin, relishing the anguished faces of the starving men. Everyone, that is, except for Turf, who kept his face a blank neutral mask, his eyes staring off into a distance only he could see. A pattern was beginning to form, and Turf was quickly realizing that if you hoped or desired for something, they would take it away from you. Anything to remind you of your place around here. They shuffled along, carrying large iron cauldrons between them, supported on thick wooden poles. The officers greeted them with jeers and hurled insults as they entered the tent and through the food service until the last of them was finally able to leave. Returning to the field kitchen with hopes of even getting a hunk of bread and a mug of tar bean tea, they were ordered to start running laps of the racing track. Everyone wants big muscles to swing their swords and pose for barmaids. You will spend far more time marching than you ever will fighting. Janix's lecture fell on deaf ears as the group huffed and puffed their way around the track. Some of the soldiers spared a glance their way, but for most the appeal had worn off, as they were no longer fresh fish, with some already hardening up to the grueling training regimen. Wha-crack! A whip crack burst over their heads as Janik expertly flicked his wrist, the whip almost an extension of his hand. The sudden bursting snap of the whip crack, louder than tempered steel hammers being struck together. The group jumped for a moment, stumbling and bumping into each other before recovering their rhythm and pushing themselves faster. Janix watched the group, hoping for a straggler. It had been weeks since he had been able to sentence someone to a good flogging. He had beaten the last man so badly his shoulder had ached for days. He couldn't recall what had happened to the man, but doubtless the bloody pulp that had remained after he had finally stopped hitting him more than likely had been fed to their fighting dogs. They needed to get a good taste for human flesh if they were going to be of any use on the battlefield. His eyes were open, but he did not see what was happening right in front of him as the mental image played in his mind's eye of the terrified man quivering and shaking as his lash struck the soft white flesh until it had turned pink and then red where it split and the blood flowed freely. The messenger had to grab Janix by the shoulder and shake him to get his attention. "Sir, we have a fresh crop of mercenaries that have just come in. Torgar wants you to put them through their paces." Janix turned to smile at the man before lifting his knee up and striking him squarely in the groin. The man made a whimpering squeal as he collapsed to the ground, curling up like a leaf on the autumn forest floor. "Don't ever touch me again." Janix placed the sole of his boot against the man's unprotected neck, whose hands were otherwise occupied with cradling his mashed manhood. As he pressed his foot down, he saw the man instantly start to buck and spasm as they desperately tried to get away. They shook their head from side to side to no avail, even going so far as to take a hand away from their crotch to gouge their fingers into the ankle of the sadistic trainer as their face turned a deep purple and their vision began to blacken. Seeing the group approaching, he lifted his foot and stepped forward to meet them. "Fresh grist for the mill." Janix appeared thoroughly unimpressed as he looked the nearest candidates up and down. Every sellsword with strength enough to lift a weapon and 2 feet to propel him forward has managed to wander into my camp at some stage, looking for some quick grog money. The volunteers looked amongst themselves and back to the bald-headed man in front of them, each wondering when someone would step forward and let the wind out of his belly with a quick sword thrust. They didn't follow orders like regular army or militia units. You pointed them at the enemy like a pack of baying dogs and you let them go. Often used as a useful distraction during sieges, they'd be slipped in through the sewer system or over an unguarded piece of wall where they would sow terror and chaos to draw more forces away from the main fight to hunt them down. "Point me to where I can pitch my tent, you bald-headed goon." A senior man stepped out of the pack and walked towards Janix. "The ogre piss that passes for wine around here is playing merry hell with my head, and I have no patience for little boys that want to play soldier." Voices in the crowd raised in agreement as they stamped their feet and started to jostle each other. They were hot and tired from standing outside in the sun, and no doubt were nursing hangovers almost to a man. A minotaur from earlier came to stand beside the senior man, used to acting as his muscle. The hulking beast didn't speak as they blew their breath loudly out of their muzzle, nostrils flaring as they bunched their hands into fists, muscles rippling and flexing along their arms up to their shoulders. Far from being intimidated, Janix's eyes lit up, his teeth flashing in a brilliant grin as he stepped forward to address the minotaur directly. "I'm surprised you could stop grazing for a minute in order to pay attention to what was going on around here." The minotaur's eyes bulged as their brows furrowed. "Do you see the field over there?" Janix pointed to a patch of grass off to the side, causing the minotaur to turn its head to follow his line of direction. We're running low on crops, and I'll need you to pull a plough for us. The Minotaur's chest started rising and falling faster and faster as they sucked in great gulps of air, trying in vain to calm their nerves. Unfazed by the boiling cauldron of rage about to explode in front of him, Janix continued. Can you reply in common, or can you just moo? The Minotaur's jaw clenched as the senior man placed a restraining hand on one of the bulging biceps, vainly trying to calm the creature. Luckily, if you get thirsty, Janix's hand shifted ever so slightly to the dairy cows of the next field over. We can milk your fat mother. Janix ducked as the Minotaur swung its great arm around in a backhanded blow that would have cracked the skull of an armored knight through the steel plating. Stepping to the side as he rose, Janix rotated his hips, throwing his whole body into a left hook that caught the Minotaur in its side. Ribs cracked loud enough to be mistaken for the snapping of dry branches. Knee buckling, it stumbled for a moment before trying to right itself. Everyone quickly shuffled back out of the range of the combatants. Blinded by berserker rage, it dug its hooves deeply into the ground, legs pistoning to launch itself forward. Clods of dirt and grass kicked up as it quickly closed the distance. They expected Janix to try and run, to turn tail in a vain attempt to escape, only to be trampled into the dirt, screams escaping his lungs as his limbs snapped like twigs. It did not happen. Remaining calm in the face of certain death, his nerves steeled by countless combats, he leapt off to the side of the charging beast, his outstretched hands wrapping around one of the curving horns. As powerfully as he was built, the Minotaur's neck muscles could not support the weight of a grown man. Lifting his legs high into the air, Janix dragged the beast down, its head suddenly snapping back to the side as its forward charge was suddenly halted. Muscles ripped and tore, tendons threatening to pop off from the bones they were anchored to, as blinding pain shot like lightning through its entire body. The crowd went silent for a moment as man and Minotaur lay unmoving. Rising to his feet with ease, Janix dusted himself off before raking his gaze across everyone assembled. Knees to the breeze, Kender Kissers! Run, I say! Run! Run! The mercenaries took off running as one, awkwardly jogging along as their gear jangled and slapped against their chests and thighs. The Minotaur lay there in the dirt, trapped in their twisted shape. Tears streamed from their big brown eyes, strings of drool hanging from the corners of their mouth as they fought for each painful breath. Draconians gathered around it like carrion bird, waiting for a herd animal to succumb to its sickness. It waited for the thrust of a blade that never came, and soon found itself rising from the ground as firm, scaly talons gripped and heaved. They passed through rows of small personal tents made from canvas greying with age and spattered with mud toward their destination. A large black tent appeared, the opening lined with runes hand-stitched in a silver thread. The symbols were unfamiliar to the Minotaur and caused his eyes to water and his head to buzz if he tried to stare at them too long. Black-robed figures appeared, their faces hidden in the shadows of their cowls. He feebly mumbled before his body finally slipped into unconsciousness. We make terrible steaks. The mercenaries did not have to endure the endless laps that Turf and his comrades had been subjected to the day before. After watching them huff and puff around the track a couple of times, they had all been gathered together. Drop your gear and strip to your waist. Metal clanged as swords, spears, and axes hit the dirt and bounced off one another. Sweat-stained shirts and tunics dropped on top. Cielo paused, unsure if, as the only woman, she was expected to comply as well. Hitch moved in front of her, crossing his arms over his chest, with a nothing-to-see-here expression on his face. She willed herself to disappear before Janix's eyes, like the conjurer that had visited her village when she was just a small child. Everyone, that is, except our lovely Lady Archer. Cielo winced at Janix's obvious reference to her. Placing a hand on Hitch's shoulder, she walked around the dwarf and made her way to stand near Janix as the eyes of everyone present followed her. She paid them no mind, keeping her chin held high as she strode over. She certainly wasn't dressed in the usual manner of a lady, sporting tan trousers and a sleeveless tunic to match, her hair tied back in a practical ponytail. Janix cast an appreciative glance towards Ciello's lithe, youthful figure, which made Hitch's blood boil. He cursed himself mentally, knowing he should have pushed harder to make her stay behind. An image flashed in his mind for a moment of Janix wrapping his arms around her, and he found himself ready to charge through the pack despite the beating he had just witnessed the Minotaur endure. Match up! Janix loudly announced as another group of people were herded over to join them by some Draconians, who appeared all too eager for the chance to use the whips and cudgels that hung from their heavy leather belts. These humans kept their shirts on, having not been ordered to strip, and possessing little in the way of gear. You lot, line up over there and face this way. Dutifully, they shuffled along until they were roughly in a line before turning to face the mercenary group. Time for you sellswords to prove your worth. Assembled before you are the most useless pieces of gully dwarf grunge the city guard could scrape together. The side with the last man standing wins hot meals and dry beds. The two sides eyed each other off with contempt and bitter hatred. Turf's men were already starving, having eaten very little and been drilled to exhaustion throughout the day. The mercenaries, for the most part, had been expected to collect their grog money and shuffle off to nurse their hangovers in the nearest tavern while awaiting their orders to march out. Now they found themselves practically being held as prisoners, with the prospect of falling asleep on rough ground with empty bellies. Hitch's gaze met Turf's, with the young man looking right through him like he did not exist. Well, what are you elven maidens waiting for? Fight! Leaping forward, the two packs streamed toward one another. The ground shook under their thundering feet, dust kicking up into the air as the distance was quickly covered. Men leapt into the air at the last moment, flying forward with knees and elbows extended. Gliding together, they cracked ribs, broke jaws, and pulped noses. Hitch took Turf to the ground in a diving tackle, wrapping his arms around the young man's waist. As they collapsed down onto the dirt, Hitch quickly scrambled up to Turf's torso to protect him from the melee whirling around them, only to be greeted with a fist to the jaw. The blow stunned Hitch for a moment, who responded in kind, his fist hammering into Turf's face, causing it to fly backwards and bounce off the ground beneath him. Damn it, boy, listen! Hitch spat, trying to make himself heard over the din. Turf swung blindly, a hook shot that Hitch easily caught with an extended forearm. Hitch grabbed him by the front of his tunic and brought his face up to his. We're here to rescue you! Turf stared for a moment, almost unwilling to believe what he was hearing. His friends had not forgotten him after all, and his waking nightmare would soon be over. Before he could react, Hitch rolled over onto his back, pulling Turf on top of him. We gotta make this look good. Before he could figure out what Hitch meant, he felt the dwarf's feet press flat against his chest. Hitch sucked in a deep breath before kicking out with both legs at the same time, launching Turf through the air like a boulder from a catapult. He crashed into another man standing side on to him that had just gotten to his feet with a triumphant look on his face after having just choked out his opponent. Turf's head whipped back, the back of his head cracking the man across the jaw with the force of a pit fighter's fist. His head whipped to the side, his legs going limp, as he and Turf crashed to the ground unconscious.